The jungles of northern Vietnam hold stories that history cannot explain. Beneath the towering canopies and the thick fog that blankets the hills at dusk, there is an unshakable sense of the past. Soldiers fought here. They bled, they cried out, and many never returned. The Battle of Dien Bien Phu marked the end of one era and the beginning of another, but for some, it was the beginning of something else entirely. A story whispered among the locals, carried on the winds that sweep through the valleys. They speak of a lone soldier who cries in the dead of night. His sobs, they say, are neither faint nor fleeting. They rise and fall like the echoes of a soul trapped in its final, anguished moments. Was it simply the wind rushing through the ridges? The groan of bamboo bending under its weight? Perhaps. But to those who have heard it, the sound is unmistakable. A human voice, raw with emotion, pleading and weeping. And it is said to come from the old battlegrounds of Dien Bien Phu. This ghostly tale has lingered for decades. No one knows the true origin of the sound, but it is said to emerge most often in March and May, the same months when the historic siege unfolded in 1954. What could possibly tie this phantom wail to one of the bloodiest confrontations of the 20th century? And why does it still haunt the living? Tonight, we trace the footsteps of this elusive legend, unraveling both its historical roots and the chilling accounts that have kept it alive. To understand the whispers that echo through the hills of Dien Bien Phu, we must first look back at the events that stained this soil with the blood of thousands. The year was 1954. France, a colonial power grasping to maintain its foothold in Southeast Asia, faced a determined enemy in the Viet Minh, a revolutionary force fighting for independence under the leadership of General Vong Nguyen Giap. The French strategy was audacious, but some would call it reckless. In November of 1953, they established a heavily fortified base in the remote valley of Dien Bien Phu, believing its location to be unassailable. Surrounded by mountains and accessible only by air, the French command felt confident they could cut off Viet Minh supply lines and force a decisive victory. But General Giap had a different vision. A meticulous strategist and a master of guerrilla warfare, he mobilized tens of thousands of troops and porters, who carried artillery piece by piece through dense jungles and up nearly impassable mountain trails. By the time the French realized what was happening, the Viet Minh had positioned heavy artillery on the surrounding hills, giving them complete control over the valley. For the French soldiers stationed at Dien Bien Phu, life quickly descended into a nightmare. The trenches became their world, muddy, cramped, and under constant threat of bombardment. Supplies ran low, morale crumbled, and as the siege wore on, the realization set in that reinforcements were not coming. Meanwhile, for the Viet Minh, victory came at a heavy cost. Thousands of fighters were lost, their sacrifices often unrecorded, their names forgotten. The siege lasted for 57 days. On May 7, 1954, the French forces surrendered. It was a humiliating defeat, marking the end of French colonial rule in Indochina and setting the stage for the Geneva Accords, which divided Vietnam into North and South. But for many who fought there, the battle did not end with surrender. The horrors they witnessed, the cries of their comrades, and the relentless pounding of artillery left scars that never healed. Perhaps this is why the stories persist. Stories of soldiers wandering the battlefield long after the guns fell silent. Stories of the crying soldier, a spirit, some say, that still mourns in the hills of Dien Bien Phu. The stories from Dien Bien Phu begin quietly, often spoken in low tones by villagers who have lived in the shadows of its hills their entire lives. These are people who know the land better than anyone, who have walked the same paths their ancestors walked, and who, to this day, refuse to go near certain places when the sun dips below the horizon. The first whispers came not long after the battle ended. Farmers working their fields began to hear strange sounds, muffled cries carried by the wind, the clinking of metal, and sometimes a single voice calling out in desperation. They would stop their work, look around, and find nothing but the dense jungle and the endless hills. At first, they chalked it up to the wind, the animals, or perhaps even their imagination. But as more people began to hear the same thing, the stories grew harder to dismiss. One elder recalls an encounter from decades ago. He was just a boy, tending to his family's livestock near one of the old battle trenches. The evening was calm, with only the occasional rustling of leaves. But then, from deep within the jungle, came the sound of crying. It started soft, almost indistinguishable from the hum of insects, but it grew louder and more distinct. It was the sound of a man sobbing uncontrollably, his voice cracking as if in utter despair. The boy froze, unsure whether to run or investigate. When he finally mustered the courage to look toward the sound, he saw nothing. No man, no animal, only the shadows cast by the setting sun. The crying continued for several minutes before abruptly stopping, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. But the stories don't end with the locals. Veterans who return to the site have their own chilling accounts. Pierre Lefebvre, a French soldier who survived the siege, spoke of a strange experience when he revisited Dien Bien Phu years later. He described camping near the old airstrip with a group of fellow veterans. That night, as they shared stories around a small fire, they heard it, a faint, mournful wail coming from the direction of the hills. It grew louder, more anguished, until it seemed to echo from every direction. It wasn't an animal, Lefebvre insisted. It was human, and it sounded like it was in pain. When they ventured out with flashlights, the sound vanished as quickly as it had begun, leaving them shaken and unable to sleep. Even modern journalists and historians who visit Dien Bien Phu report strange occurrences. Some hear the cries, others feel an inexplicable heaviness as they walk the old trenches. One journalist described a moment where the air grew unnaturally still, and the faint sound of boots marching reached his ears. When he turned to look, there was no one there, only the overgrown jungle reclaiming the battlefield. What stands out most is the consistency of these accounts. The crying is always the same, desperate, full of sorrow, and impossible to ignore. Locals believe it is the spirit of a soldier, a man who died far from home, unable to find peace. Others think it is more than just one voice, that it is the collective grief of thousands of souls lost to a brutal, unrelenting war. A retired Vietnamese soldier once offered his perspective. He spoke of the young men on both sides of the conflict, boys who left their families, their homes, and their dreams behind. He said, "War doesn't end for the dead. The cries you hear are not just from one soldier, they are from all of them, the ones who never made it back. Their stories are unfinished, their voices are trapped here." This belief is echoed by those who live nearby. They claim the cries are most often heard during certain times of the year, March and May, when the siege began and ended. It is as if the land itself remembers the battle, replaying its sorrow like an old broken record. For decades, the legend of the crying soldier has haunted Dien Bien Phu. The tales are as varied as the people who tell them, but the core of the story remains the same. A lone figure, dressed in tattered military garb, roaming the hills and valleys at night. He is seen only fleetingly, just long enough for the unlucky observer to catch a glimpse before he vanishes. But the sound of his sorrow, they say, lingers long after. One version of the legend claims that the crying soldier was a French officer stationed at Dien Bien Phu during the final days of the siege. He was young, barely more than a boy, and reportedly carried a photograph of his fiancée back home in France. As the Viet Minh artillery rained down on the French stronghold, he clung to the hope that reinforcements would arrive in time to save them. But they never came. When the French lines finally collapsed, the story goes, he stayed behind, refusing to surrender, and was ultimately killed in the chaos. His body was never recovered, and locals say his spirit remains bound to the place where he fell, forever searching for a way home. Another account suggests that the crying soldier was not French at all, but a young Viet Minh fighter. This version paints a picture of a devoted son who joined the revolution to protect his family and his homeland. He fought bravely, they say, but the horrors of war broke something inside him. Toward the end of the siege, he reportedly wandered into the jungle, disoriented and weeping, and was never seen again. Villagers claim that his cries echo through the hills to this day, a reminder of a soul lost too soon. There are those who have encountered him, or claim to have. A Vietnamese farmer, working late into the evening, once described seeing a man in military uniform sitting on a boulder near an old battlefield. The man appeared to be crying, his head in his hands. The farmer approached cautiously, but before he could say a word, the figure looked up, revealing hollow eyes and a face streaked with tears. The farmer ran, but when he glanced back, the man was gone. Another account comes from a French journalist who visited the site in the 1980s. While photographing the remnants of the trenches, she reported hearing soft, guttural sobbing from a nearby grove. She assumed it was another visitor and walked toward the sound, but as she neared the source, it abruptly stopped. When she checked the grove, it was empty. She later remarked that the experience left her with an unshakable sense of unease. Theories about the crying soldier abound. Some believe it is a ghost, a soul unable to move on due to the trauma and heartbreak of war. They argue that the intense emotions of the soldiers who fought and died here, fear, anger, despair, left an imprint on the land, creating a lingering presence. Others offer a more rational explanation. They suggest that the sounds of crying and the sightings of ghostly figures are tricks of the mind, amplified by the eerie stillness of the jungle and the haunting history of the battlefield. But for those who have heard the cries or seen the figure themselves, no explanation, supernatural or otherwise, can erase the feeling of being watched, of being in the presence of something that cannot be understood. The crying soldier is not just a ghost story. It is a symbol of the countless lives lost at Dien, of the pain and sorrow that war leaves in its wake. Dien Bien Phu is not the only place where echoes of war seem to linger. Throughout history, stories of ghostly encounters have emerged from battlefields all over the world. It's almost as if the very ground on which blood was spilled holds on to the pain, replaying it for those who dare to listen. During the Vietnam War, similar tales have been told. Soldiers stationed deep in the jungle often reported strange happenings, lights flickering in the distance, disembodied whispers carried by the wind, or figures that seemed to vanish the moment they were approached. One chilling story from the conflict tells of an American soldier on night watch who repeatedly saw a shadowy figure moving among the trees. Each time he tried to confront it, the figure dissolved into the darkness, leaving behind a faint, haunting wail. But these stories are not unique to Vietnam. During World War I, soldiers on the Western Front described hearing eerie sounds in the trenches at night, footsteps, murmured prayers, and the unmistakable sobs of men who had long since died. In one account, a group of British soldiers claimed they saw a spectral battalion marching silently across no man's land, their faces pale and gaunt, their uniforms torn and bloodied. World War II brought its own tales of battlefield hauntings. In the forests of Poland, near where some of the most brutal fighting of the Eastern Front occurred, locals have long reported sightings of ghostly figures wandering the woods, their eyes hollow and filled with sorrow. Even decades later, hikers and hunters speak of hearing faint cries and footsteps in the snow, though no one is ever there. The question arises, why do such stories persist? Why do so many believe that the spirits of soldiers linger on battlefields? One explanation lies in the profound trauma of war. Soldiers who go to war often carry immense emotional and physical burdens, fear, guilt, and the pain of leaving their families behind. When they die in violent and traumatic ways, many believe their spirits become trapped, unable to move on. These unresolved emotions, it is said, leave a mark on the land, like an invisible scar that cannot be healed. For the survivors, these ghost stories may reflect something deeper. They are reminders of the human cost of war, of lives cut short and futures destroyed. They speak to the collective grief of nations, the pain of families waiting for loved ones who will never return, and the enduring legacy of loss that war leaves behind. Psychologists have long studied the impact of war on the human psyche, coining terms like shell shock and post-traumatic stress disorder, to describe the emotional toll it takes. For some, ghost stories serve as a way to process this trauma, a way to give voice to the pain and guilt that lingers long after the fighting is over. These stories are not just about the supernatural, they are about memory and the way we remember those who were lost. The legend of the crying soldier of Dien Bien Phu is part of this larger narrative, a reminder that even in death, the voices of the fallen continue to be heard. Whether one believes in ghosts or not, the stories reflect something very real, the enduring pain of war and the deep scars it leaves on those who experience it. In the decades since the last shots were fired at Dien Bien Phu, the legend of the crying soldier has drawn both believers and skeptics to the battlefield. Some seek answers, others seek closure, and a few, armed with cameras and recording devices, hope to capture proof of the unexplained. Paranormal investigators from around the world have traveled to this remote corner of Vietnam, where the hills and valleys are said to echo with the cries of a forgotten soldier. Equipped with state-of-the-art technology, infrared cameras, electromagnetic field detectors, and sensitive audio recorders, they have scoured the battlefield, documenting their findings. In one investigation conducted in the early 2000s, a team set up camp near one of the overgrown French bunkers. For hours, they heard nothing but the sounds of the jungle, the chirping of insects, and the distant rustling of leaves. But then, just after midnight, their audio equipment picked up something unusual, a faint sound that, when amplified, resembled a man softly weeping. The recording was later analyzed by sound engineers who confirmed that the frequency of the cries did not match any known animal in the region. Skeptics, however, argued that the sound could have been caused by the wind or the shifting of vegetation. Photographs taken in the area have also added to the mystery. One particularly famous image shows what appears to be a faint, shadowy figure standing among the trees near an old trench. The figure's outline is indistinct, but many claim it resembles a man in military uniform. Critics dismiss it as a trick of the light, an example of pareidolia, the human tendency to perceive familiar shapes in random patterns. Yet, for those who have visited the site, the photograph feels like validation of the strange sensations they experienced while there. One of the most compelling accounts comes from a Vietnamese historian who has spent years studying the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. While conducting research in the area, he reported hearing soft footsteps behind him as he walked through an abandoned bunker. When he turned around, there was no one there. Later that evening, as he reviewed his notes, he felt an overwhelming sense of sadness, as if the walls themselves were mourning the lives lost so long ago. He has since described the experience as both unsettling and deeply moving, a reminder of the human cost of war. But not everyone believes in ghosts. Some scientists argue that the so-called paranormal phenomena at Dien Bien Phu can be explained by natural causes. They point to the region's unique geography and climate, which create conditions that can distort sound and light. The cries, they suggest, could be the result of wind passing through the narrow valleys, while the apparitions might be caused by humidity and mist refracting light in unusual ways. Others take a psychological approach. They propose that the power of suggestion, combined with the emotional weight of the battlefield, might be enough to create the illusion of ghostly activity. For many visitors, the knowledge that thousands of soldiers died here in brutal and horrifying ways is enough to evoke feelings of unease and sadness, which can manifest as sensory experiences. Yet, despite these rational explanations, the stories persist. For every skeptic who dismisses the legend of the crying soldier, there is someone who has heard the cries, seen the figure, or felt the presence. Whether real or imagined, the ghostly phenomena of Dien Bien Phu serve as a powerful reminder of the sacrifices made during one of the most pivotal battles in modern history. As we stand on the hills of Dien Bien Phu today, the landscape may appear tranquil. The dense jungle has slowly reclaimed the land where once fierce battles were fought, where the sound of artillery and gunfire pierced the air. The battlefields are quiet now, but the echoes of the past remain. They are embedded in the soil, woven into the very air that we breathe. For those who lived through the horrors of war, those memories never truly fade. War is not just fought with weapons, it's fought with the souls of those who are involved. The scars it leaves are not always visible. The psychological toll of violence, loss, and trauma can stretch for generations. It seeps into the landscape itself, marking the land in ways we may never fully understand. In a place like Dien Bien Phu, where thousands of lives were lost in a matter of days, those scars are especially profound. And so, it is not surprising that stories of ghostly encounters like the crying soldier persist. Are they simply remnants of the past? Echoes of trauma lingering in the minds of those who witnessed the horrors? Or are they truly the restless spirits of the fallen, trapped in the place where they met their untimely end? The reality is that war's cost extends beyond the battlefield. It affects the very heart of a nation, the families left behind, and the survivors who must carry on. For the soldiers who fought at Dien Bien Phu, whether French or Viet Minh, the psychological toll of that battle is unimaginable. Many returned home, but they never truly left the battlefield. Some carried the weight of what they had seen, heard, and experienced long after they left the war behind. The emotional scars of combat are invisible, but they are often the most difficult to heal. In many cultures, stories like the Crying Soldier are more than just legends. They are a way of preserving the memory of those who fought and died. The Vietnamese people, for example, have long honored their fallen soldiers with monuments and ceremonies, ensuring that the sacrifices of the past are never forgotten. In France, the soldiers of Dien Bien Phu are remembered for their bravery, though their defeat remains a painful chapter in their history. Even as time passes, we continue to hold on to these stories, not just to remember, but to understand the true cost of war, the lives lost, the futures stolen, and the trauma that lingers long after the guns fall silent. These stories, whether they come in the form of paranormal sightings or simple acts of remembrance, serve as a reminder that war is never truly over. It lives on in the hearts of those who fought, in the land where battles were waged, and in the collective memory of those who continue to honor the fallen. They are part of the fabric of our shared history, woven into the narrative of humanity's struggle, and they remind us that the consequences of war reach far beyond the battlefield. The legend of the Crying Soldier persists, and with it, the question, is it the echo of a lost soul, forever bound to the land of Dien Bien Phu, or is it simply a story passed down over time, shaped by the ghosts of memory and trauma? We may never truly know, but what we do know is that war leaves scars that go beyond the physical. It leaves behind something intangible, something that lingers in the air, in the land, and in the hearts of those who were touched by its horrors. Perhaps that is why the Crying Soldier's voice continues to be heard all these years later. So what do you think? Do you believe in the Crying Soldier? Do the sounds in the night belong to a spirit who never found peace, or are they merely the reverberations of a tragic history that refuses to fade? Have you heard stories like this before? Tales from the battlefield that refuse to be silenced. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and share your theories. Have you ever had an experience that you couldn't explain? A ghostly encounter? Or perhaps a moment where the past seemed to reach out to you in the present? Ghosts of war may never fully depart, but in their haunting, they remind us of the price of peace, a price too often paid in lives and in memories that refuse to fade. Remember, the past never truly disappears. It just waits quietly to be heard once again.